The clang of hammer against steel echoed through the dusty streets of St. Joe, Missouri, in 1875, drawing scowls and muttered curses from the men passing by the small blacksmith shop at the edge of town. Inside, Johanna Keller wiped sweat from her brow, her muscled arms bearing the marks of her trade calluses, small burns, and the occasional scar. At 26, she stood alone at her forge, the only female blacksmith in 3 counties, perhaps in the entire state, and certainly the most despised business owner in St. Joe. The morning sun barely crested the horizon when the first insults of the day reached her ears. Johanna didn't bother looking up from the horseshoe she was hammering into shape, the metal glowing orange-red as she struck it with practiced precision. "You burned that shoe too hot again, Keller," called Herbert Dawson, the town's feed store owner. "My cousin's horse nearly went lame after your shodding job last month." "Your cousin's horse stepped on a nail 2 days after I shod him, Mr. Dawson," Johanna replied evenly, still focused on her work. "As I explained when he came back complaining." "A real blacksmith wouldn't make excuses," another voice joined in. Thomas Wells, the town banker, stood beside Dawson, his expensive suit looking out of place next to the forge. "A woman has no business doing a man's job." Johanna set her jaw and continued working. She'd heard it all before every day for the past 2 years since her father's death had left her in charge of the family smithy. The townsfolk had tolerated her helping her father, learning the trade at his side since she was 12. But a woman running a blacksmith shop alone. That was apparently unforgivable in St. Joe. "My father taught me everything he knew, Mr. Wells," she said without looking up, "and before he passed, he had more business than he could handle." "Out of respect for your father, not for his girl playing at being a smith," Wells sneered. Johanna finished the horseshoe with one final strike, plunging it into water with a satisfying hiss of steam. She'd long stopped expecting fairness from the men of St. Joe, but their constant harassment made each day a battle. If not for Mrs. Holloway and a few other widows who brought her what work they could, she'd have been forced to sell the shop months ago. "If you gentlemen aren't here for business, I'd appreciate some peace to work," she said, finally looking up to meet their gazes. The men might have continued their taunts if not for the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A tall, dust-covered stranger rode into view on a handsome chestnut stallion. The horse moved with a slight irregularity, favoring its right front hoof. The rider dismounted in a fluid motion that spoke of years in the saddle. He was lean but broad-shouldered, with sun-weathered skin and eyes that took in the scene with a quiet intensity. His clothes were trail-worn but of good quality, and the gun at his hip looked well used but meticulously maintained. "Excuse me," he addressed the group, tipping his hat slightly. "I'm looking for a blacksmith. My horse threw a shoe about 3 miles back." Herbert Dawson chuckled. "Well, you found what passes for one in St. Joe, though if you value that fine animal you might want to ride on to Jefferson City." The stranger's gaze shifted to Johanna, taking in her leather apron, her rolled-up sleeves, and the hammer still in her hand. If he was surprised to find a woman at the forge, he didn't show it. "Can you help me, madam?" he asked simply. Before Johanna could answer, Thomas Wells stepped forward. "Now see here, stranger. There's a proper smithy in Blackwater, not but a day's ride from here." "Miss Keller here just plays at I asked the blacksmith, not you," the stranger interrupted, his voice calm but firm. He turned back to Johanna. "My horse needs attention sooner rather than later. Can you help?" Johanna straightened her spine. "I can. Bring him into the yard, Mr. Zachariah Flynn," he replied. "Most folks call me Zach." "Miss Johanna Keller," she returned, extending a hand that was promptly met with a firm shake. "Let's have a look at your horse." As Flynn led his mount into the small yard behind her shop, Wells and Dawson skulked away, muttering about foolish strangers and stubborn women. Johanna was accustomed to their departing insults, but something about this stranger's straightforward manner gave her a moment's respite from the usual sting. She examined the horse's hoof carefully, running experienced hands along the leg. Clean break from the shoe, no damage to the hoof wall. He'll need a new one, but it's a simple job. Flynn nodded, watching as she took measurements. How long have you been smithing, Miss Keller? 14 years alongside my father. 2 years on my own since he passed, she answered, leading the horse to the hitching post near her forge. That's considerable experience. More than most in these parts, though folks around here tend to overlook that part, she said, selecting iron stock for the new shoe. Flynn leaned against a post, observing her work. I've been riding for 15 years, Miss Keller, and I've seen plenty of blacksmiths across 4 states. I can tell within minutes if one knows their craft. Johanna heated the iron, her movements efficient. And your assessment of me? I haven't seen you work yet, he replied with the hint of a smile. But you know exactly what you're doing with that horse, which tells me plenty. For the next hour, Johanna worked while Flynn quietly observed. She shaped the shoe with precision, fitting it perfectly to the horse's hoof. Unlike most customers, who either doubted her every move or avoided watching altogether, Flynn asked thoughtful questions about her technique. That's some fine work, he commented as she finished. Better than the last 3 smiths who have shod thunder, if I'm honest. Johanna couldn't help the small surge of pride at his words. Thunder's a fine horse, deserves proper care. She patted the stallion's neck. You've taken good care of him. We've been through a lot together, Flynn replied, running a hand along Thunder's flank. What do I owe you? She named her price fair, not inflated as some might expect from the town's only blacksmith. Flynn paid without haggling, adding a bit extra that she tried to refuse. For the rush job, he insisted. I appreciate the prompt attention. As Flynn prepared to leave, a commotion erupted from the street. Sheriff Parker and several men had gathered outside the general store, where a notice was being posted. Trouble? Flynn asked, hand instinctively moving toward his gun. Just the usual town business, Johanna replied. Though curiosity drew her toward the gathering, Flynn followed, leading Thunder. They joined the edge of the crowd as Sheriff Parker cleared his throat. As you all know, the town council has approved plans for the railroad spur to connect St. Joe directly to the main line, Parker announced. Construction begins next month, and they'll be needing considerable metalwork rails, spikes, tools, repairs. The contract will go to a qualified blacksmith who can handle the volume. Johanna's heart quickened. A railroad contract could save her shop, provide the security she'd been fighting for since her father's death. Bids will be accepted for the next 2 weeks, Parker continued. Council will review and select based on experience, capability, and cost. As the crowd dispersed, several men looked Johanna's way with smirks and dismissive laughs. Don't even think about it, Keller, called Edward Mason, who owned the livery stable. Railroad work is for real smiths, not girls playing with hammers. I assume you'll be submitting a bid, Flynn said quietly beside her as they walked back toward her shop. Johanna sighed. I should. That contract would secure my business for years, but the town council. She trailed off. We'll never give it to a woman, Flynn finished for her, precisely. They barely tolerate me fixing pots and shoeing the occasional horse. Flynn studied her for a moment. That's their mistake. I've seen enough today to know you've got skill most smiths would envy. His words, spoken with such matter-of-fact confidence, caught her off guard. Johanna wasn't accustomed to genuine praise, especially from strangers. "You riding through or staying in town, Mr. Flynn?" she asked, changing the subject. "Plan to stay a few days. I've got business in the area." He mounted Thunder, adjusting his hat against the afternoon sun. "May need some other work done while I'm here. My saddle could use a new stirrup leather." "I'd be happy to help with that," she replied. As Flynn rode away, Johanna returned to her forge, mind whirling with thoughts of the railroad contract. It would be foolish to hope, she knew. But for the first time in months, the spark of possibility flickered to life within her. The next morning arrived with unusual commotion. Johanna had just opened her shop when 3 men on horseback thundered past, Sheriff Parker among them. Curious, she stepped outside in time to see Flynn approaching from the direction of the hotel. "What's happening?" she asked. "Stagecoach robbery about 5 miles south," he replied, his expression grim. "Driver was shot. They're looking for the bandits." "That'd be the Carson brothers, most likely," Johanna said. "They've been causing trouble all through the county for months." Flynn nodded. "Sheriff asked for volunteers to join the posse. I offered my tracking skills." Before Johanna could respond, Mason from the livery approached, leading a horse. "Flynn, Sheriff says you're coming along. Here's a mount." "I've got my own horse, thanks," Flynn replied. Mason snorted. "Better take this one. Can't trust that animal of yours after Keller got her hands on him." Johanna felt her face flush with anger, but Flynn merely smiled thinly. "Thunder's never moved better, actually," he said. "Miss Keller did excellent work. I'll stick with my own mount." Mason's face darkened. "Your funeral when that shoe comes off mid-chase." As Mason stormed off, Flynn turned to Johanna. "I should get going. They're waiting." "Be careful," she said. "The Carsons don't surrender easily." Flynn tipped his hat. "I'll come by later about that saddle work, assuming we catch these outlaws quickly." The posse departed, leaving Johanna to a quieter day than usual. With most of the men out chasing bandits, the town seemed temporarily free of those who typically harassed her. She used the peace to work on several projects she'd been putting off, including sketching plans for the railroad bid she knew she should submit, despite the inevitable rejection. It was late afternoon when the posse returned. Johanna heard them before she saw them, voices raised in excitement, horses' hooves on the packed dirt of Main Street. She stepped outside to see a triumphant procession. 3 men rode with their hands bound, heads bowed, the Carson brothers, finally captured. Sheriff Parker led the group, looking pleased. Behind him, Flynn rode alongside the prisoners, alert despite what must have been an exhausting day. As they passed the blacksmith shop, Flynn caught her eye and nodded slightly. Later that evening, after Johanna had banked her forge and was preparing to close up, Flynn returned. He looked tired but satisfied, dismounting with the same easy grace she'd noticed the day before. "Successful hunt, I see," she remarked, wiping her hands on her apron. "Those Carsons knew the hills well, but not well enough," he replied. "They'll face a judge in Jefferson City next week. The whole town will breathe easier. They've robbed 3 stages in as many months." Flynn nodded, leading Thunder into the yard. "About that saddle work." As Johanna examined his saddle, Flynn leaned against a workbench, watching her skilled hands assess the worn leather. "You mentioned business in town," she said conversationally. "Mind if I ask what kind?" Flynn was quiet for a moment. "Looking for land, actually." Army pension finally came through after 5 years of fighting bureaucrats, almost as hard as we fought in the war. "You fought in the war?" Johanna looked up, studying him with new interest. "Cavalry. Enlisted in '63, stayed till the end." He flexed his left hand unconsciously, and Johanna noticed a long scar running from wrist to knuckle. "Been drifting since, doing odd jobs, saving what I could." "And now you're looking to settle. time to put down roots," he confirmed. "This valley has good grazing land, fair prices." "Thinking of raising horses?" Johanna nodded, setting the saddle aside. "I can replace both stirrup leathers and reinforce the cinch while I'm at it. Should take a day or so." "No rush," Flynn said. "I'll be around at least a week looking at properties." As he turned to leave, he paused. "You planning to bid on that railroad contract?" Johanna sighed. "I've been drafting some figures, but it's likely a waste of time. Because the town council won't consider you. They've made their opinions of me quite clear over the years." Flynn considered this. "You know, I've worked with railroads before. After the war, I spent 2 years with Union Pacific. I know what they look for in contracts." "You offering advice, Mr. Flynn?" she asked, surprised. "If you'd accept it." "Seems to me the town's prejudice is costing them the best blacksmith in the county." His straightforward belief in her skills, stated so matter-of-factly, stirred something in Johanna that she hadn't felt in years, a sense of possibility, of being seen for her abilities rather than her gender. "I'd welcome any insights," she finally said, "though I doubt it will change the outcome." Flynn smiled, the expression warming his weather-lined face. "Let's see what we can do about that." Over the next few days, a pattern emerged. Flynn would spend his mornings looking at properties with the land agent, then stop by Johanna's shop in the afternoons. Together, they worked on her bid for the railroad contract. Flynn's knowledge of railroad operations provided valuable perspective, while Johanna's expertise in metalworking formed the foundation of their proposal. Their collaboration did not go unnoticed in St. Joe. Whispers followed Johanna as she made her weekly trip to the general store for supplies. "Shameless, that's what it is," she overheard Mrs. Dawson telling another woman. "Flaunting herself at that stranger, using a business matter as an excuse." "He seems a decent sort," the other woman replied. "Wonder what he sees in her, though. Not exactly feminine, is she?" Johanna kept her head high, paying for her purchases and leaving without acknowledging the gossip. She'd long since learned that showing hurt only encouraged more cruelty. When she returned to her shop, she found Flynn waiting, a parcel under his arm. "Brought some papers from my railroad days," he explained. "Thought they might help with the bid specifications." As they worked side by side at her small desk, Flynn occasionally asked about her past, how she'd learned blacksmithing, why she stayed in a town that clearly resented her success. "My father had no sons," she explained, sketching a design for a specialized rail spike. "Just me and my mother, who passed when I was 10. He started teaching me the trade because he needed the help, but I took to it naturally." "He must have been proud," Flynn remarked. Johanna smiled at the memory. "He was. Never once suggested it wasn't proper work for a girl. Said talent was talent, regardless of who possessed it." Her smile faded. "The town tolerated it when he was alive. A daughter helping her father was eccentric but acceptable. A woman running a smithy alone is apparently an affront to the natural order. Why stay? Surely other towns might be more accepting." She looked around the shop, at the tools her father had used, the forge he'd built with his own hands. "This place is all I have left of him. And it's mine. I own the building outright. No mortgage, no landlord who can force me out. If I left, I'd be starting with nothing." Flynn nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Sometimes standing your ground is the only choice that makes sense." "What about you?" she asked. "You mentioned the cavalry, then the railroad. How did you end up considering St. Joe?" A shadow crossed his face. "After the war, I couldn't settle anywhere. Too many memories, too much loss. The railroad work kept me moving, which suited me fine." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Lost my brother at Shiloh, my parents to fever during the war. Been alone a long time." "I understand loneliness," Johanna said quietly. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, recognition of kindred spirits who had weathered storms and emerged resilient, if somewhat battered. The moment was broken by the arrival of Thomas Wells and Edward Mason. They entered the shop without knocking, Wells leading with his usual air of superiority. "Miss Keller," he began without preamble, "we've heard you're preparing a bid for the railroad contract." Johanna straightened, setting down her pencil. "News travels fast in St. Joe." "It's a small town," Mason said, eyeing Flynn with suspicion, "and this stranger seems mighty interested in your business." Flynn stood, his posture relaxed but alert. "Mr. Flynn," he introduced himself, extending a hand that neither man took. Wells ignored him. "We're here as a courtesy, Miss Keller. The railroad contract requires experience with large-scale metalwork, consistency of production, and reliability that, frankly, you cannot provide." "I've been running this shop successfully for 2 years, Mr. Wells," Johanna replied evenly. "Before that, I worked alongside my father for 12 years on projects of all sizes. A woman's constitution isn't suited for the rigors of railroad work," Mason added. "It would be embarrassing for the town to have you fail publicly when the railroad expects professional results." Flynn stepped forward. "Gentlemen, I've spent 2 years working railroad construction. I've seen blacksmiths from St. Louis to Sacramento. Miss Keller's work is exceptional by any standard." Wells turned to Flynn, irritation clear on his face. "You're not from here, sir. You don't understand our ways. If your ways include ignoring skill in favor of prejudice, then no, I don't understand them," Flynn replied, his voice calm but firm. Mason's face reddened. "Now see here, stranger. I think we've said what we came to say," Wells interrupted, clearly wanting to avoid confrontation. "Miss Keller, consider yourself warned. The council won't look favorably on your bid, and you'll only embarrass yourself by submitting one." After they left, Johanna released a long breath. "That's what I'm up against." Flynn's jaw was tight with anger. "Men like that can't stand seeing a woman succeed where they believe only men should." "It's not just them," Johanna said wearily. "It's most of the town. They see me as either an object of pity or ridicule, the stubborn woman who won't accept her proper place." "And what is your proper place in their eyes? Married, keeping house, raising children, or if unmarried, working as a seamstress or a teacher or a housekeeper?" She gestured to the forge. "Not this, never this." Flynn studied her for a long moment. "What if we could prove them wrong?" "How? The council will reject my bid no matter how good it is." "Maybe," Flynn conceded. "But what if we could demonstrate your skills so publicly they couldn't ignore it?" Johanna raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." The next day, the town of St. Joe witnessed something unprecedented. Zachariah Flynn rode through the main street, stopping at various businesses, speaking earnestly to the owners. By noon, a small crowd had gathered in the open area near the livery stable, where Flynn had arranged for a public demonstration. Johanna arrived with a wagon containing her portable forge, anvil, and tools. She'd agreed to Flynn's plan with trepidation, knowing she was risking further humiliation if things went poorly. But something about his confidence in her had kindled a forgotten courage. Flynn addressed the gathered crowd, which included most of the town's businessmen and a good number of curious residents. "Ladies and gentlemen of St. Joe, thank you for coming. I've heard much discussion about the upcoming railroad contract and who might be qualified to fulfill it. Today, I propose a simple demonstration of skill." Thomas Wells pushed to the front. "What's the meaning of this, Flynn? We don't need theatrics to determine who gets the contract." "No theatrics, Mr. Wells. Just a fair assessment of skill." Flynn gestured to where Edward Mason stood with two other men who Johanna recognized as blacksmiths from neighboring towns. "I've invited these gentlemen to participate in a contest of sorts. Each will forge the same item, a specialized spike used in railroad construction. I'll judge the results based on my experience with Union Pacific." The crowd murmured with interest. Such contests were not uncommon at county fairs, though women certainly didn't participate. "This is ridiculous," Wells protested. "Miss Keller can't possibly. Are the men of St. Joe afraid to compete with a woman?" Flynn interrupted, his voice carrying across the gathering. "Where I come from, skill speaks for itself, regardless of who wields the hammer." The challenge hung in the air. Mason and the other blacksmiths exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the situation but unwilling to back down and appear cowardly. "Fine," Mason finally said. "Let's see this contest, though it seems a waste of good coal to heat a woman's forge." The rules were simple. Each smith would forge 3 railroad spikes to the exact specifications Flynn provided. They would be judged on accuracy, quality, and time. The crowd grew as word spread through town, until nearly everyone in St. Joe had gathered to watch. Johanna took her position at her portable forge, ignoring the whispers and stares. She'd spent her life working under scrutiny, though never quite this public. As she prepared her materials, she felt a calm determination replace her earlier anxiety. Flynn gave the signal to begin. The 4 forges roared to life as coal was stoked and bellows pumped. Johanna worked with practiced efficiency, her movements precise and economical. She barely heard the commentary from the crowd, focusing entirely on the metal heating in her forge. As the contest progressed, the initial jeers and jokes at Johanna's expense gradually diminished. Even those who had come expecting to mock her fell silent, watching with growing amazement as her skilled hands shaped the hot iron with seemingly effortless precision. Flynn walked between the smiths, observing their techniques without comment. When Johanna completed her 3rd spike first among the competitors, a murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. The last smith finished nearly 15 minutes after Johanna. Flynn collected the finished pieces, examining each carefully against his specifications. The crowd pressed closer, curious to see the results. "I've assessed each smith's work," Flynn announced after his examination. "Based on accuracy to specifications, quality of finish, and time to completion, there is a clear winner." He paused, looking directly at Thomas Wells and the other town council members who had gathered near the front. "Miss Johanna Keller's work is superior in all respects. Her spikes meet railroad specifications perfectly, with excellent finish quality, and she completed them in the shortest time." A stunned silence fell over the gathering. Johanna stood by her forge, her face flushed from the heat and from the unexpected vindication. "This must be some trick," Mason protested. "She must have practiced beforehand." "I provided the specifications only today," Flynn countered, "and everyone worked with the same materials and constraints. The results speak for themselves." He held up the spikes for all to see. "Anyone with knowledge of smithing can examine these and verify my assessment." Several men stepped forward to look at the finished products, including old Samuel Peterson, who had retired from blacksmithing years ago but was still respected for his expertise. "The woman's work is better," Peterson admitted grudgingly after inspecting the spikes. "Cleaner lines, proper weight, better finish." The admission from Peterson, who had never shown Johanna anything but disdain, sent another wave of murmurs through the crowd. Wells and the other council members conferred quietly among themselves. Flynn addressed the town council directly. "Gentlemen, You have a responsibility to select the best blacksmith for your railroad contract, the one whose work will ensure safety and quality for the trains that will serve your town. Today you've seen clear evidence of who that is." Sheriff Parker, who also served on the council, cleared his throat. "This demonstration is surprising, but a railroad contract involves more than making a few spikes. It requires consistent production, reliability, physical stamina, all of which Miss Keller has demonstrated over 2 years of running her shop single-handedly," Flynn interrupted. "I challenge any man here to work a forge 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, as she does." The crowd's mood had shifted noticeably. Where there had been dismissive amusement at the beginning, now there was thoughtful consideration and, in some faces, a reluctant respect. "We'll take this demonstration into account when reviewing bids," Wells finally said, clearly displeased but aware of the public sentiment shifting. "The council will make its decision based on all relevant factors." As the crowd dispersed, many lingered to examine Johanna's work more closely or to speak with her directly. For the first time since her father's death, she found herself receiving genuine questions about her craft rather than dismissal. Flynn helped her load her equipment back onto the wagon. "You showed them today," he said quietly. "Thanks to you," she replied. "I would never have thought to arrange such a demonstration. I only created the opportunity. Your skill did the rest." As they returned to her shop, Johanna felt a weight lifting, not completely gone, but lighter than it had been in years. Whether or not she received the contract, something had changed in St. Joe today, and something had changed within her as well. The next morning, Johanna opened her shop to find a small bouquet of wildflowers on her doorstep. No note accompanied them, but she didn't need one to know who had left them. The gesture, simple and unexpected, brought a smile to her face that lingered as she stoked her forge. The day brought an unusual number of customers, some curious after yesterday's demonstration, others bringing work they had previously taken elsewhere. By midday, Johanna had more orders than she'd received in the previous 2 weeks combined. Flynn appeared in the afternoon, leading Thunder and another horse, a beautiful gray mare with intelligent eyes. "Just purchased her," he explained, patting the mare's neck. "Part of my plans for the horse farm." "She's lovely," Johanna said, admiring the animal's clean lines and well-muscled shoulders. "Have you found land then?" "The Hargrove property, about 3 miles east of town. 160 acres, good water access, decent buildings that need some work." He smiled. "Signed the papers this morning." "Congratulations," Johanna said, genuinely pleased. "That's excellent grazing land." "It is." Flynn hesitated, then added, "I'd value your opinion on some of the repairs needed. The barn needs new hinges and latches, for one thing." "I'd be happy to help," she offered. "Perhaps you could ride out with me tomorrow to see it, Sunday being your day off, I believe." The invitation caught her by surprise. It wasn't unusual for a blacksmith to consult on building repairs, but the way Flynn asked, slightly hesitant, his usual confidence momentarily muted, suggested something more than professional consultation. "I'd like that," she found herself saying. Flynn's smile widened. "Excellent. I'll come by at noon if that suits." After he left, Johanna found herself distracted, thoughts drifting to their planned ride the next day. It had been years since she'd done anything that might be construed as social. Since her father's death, her life had narrowed to work and survival, with little room for anything else. Sunday dawned clear and mild. Johanna dressed with more care than usual, selecting a riding skirt she rarely wore and a blouse that her mother had embroidered years ago. She even took time to arrange her hair differently, pinning it up more neatly than her usual practical style. Flynn arrived precisely at noon, leading both horses. He had cleaned up as well, his usual trail clothes replaced with a newer shirt and vest. He helped her mount the gray mare with a courtesy that acknowledged her capability while still offering assistance. "She's gentle but spirited," he said, as Johanna settled into the saddle. "Thought you two might suit each other." They rode east out of town, drawing curious glances from the few townspeople they passed. Once beyond the town limits, the prairie opened before them, rolling hills dotted with wildflowers and the occasional stand of trees. Flynn spoke about his plans for the property breeding and training quality horses, eventually expanding to a full ranch operation. Johanna found herself offering suggestions based on her knowledge of local conditions and her father's experiences with ranchers' needs. "You understand this land well," Flynn observed as they crested a hill that provided a view of his new property below. "I've lived here all my life," she replied. "Father considered moving west several times, especially after Mother died, but something always kept us here. Do you regret staying?" Johanna considered the question. "Sometimes, especially these past 2 years, but this is home for better or worse." They reached the property where a modest farmhouse stood beside a large barn and several outbuildings. The structures were weathered but solid, needing repairs rather than replacement. Flynn showed her around the grounds, pointing out the work needed hinges for the barn doors, latches for stalls, repairs to the watering troughs, and various tools that needed forging or mending. "You could keep me busy for months with all this," Johanna remarked as they inspected the barn. "I was hoping you might," Flynn replied, his voice quieter than before. "I value craftsmanship, and yours is exceptional." Their eyes met, and Johanna felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. Flynn stepped closer, his usual composure giving way to something more vulnerable. "Miss Keller, Johanna, I should be direct. My interest in your skill is genuine, but I find myself equally interested in the woman behind that skill." The confession hung in the air between them. Johanna's heart quickened as she realized what he was saying. "We've known each other barely a week, Mr. Flynn," she said softly. "Zach," he corrected. "And yes, it hasn't been long, but sometimes you recognize what's right when you see it." He hesitated, then added, "I'm not asking for promises, just permission to call on you properly to see where this might lead." Johanna had long ago resigned herself to spinsterhood. In St. Joe, no man had ever shown interest beyond occasional crude propositions that had more to do with her isolation than any genuine attraction. Flynn's straightforward request, respectful but clear in its intent, was entirely new territory. "I'd like that," she finally answered, surprising herself with how much she meant it. The ride back to town was filled with easier conversation, punctuated by comfortable silences. As they approached her shop, Flynn asked, "Will you submit your bid for the railroad contract tomorrow?" "Yes," she replied. "After yesterday's demonstration, they can't simply dismiss it outright." "Good. St. Joe needs your skills whether they realize it yet or not." He helped her dismount when they reached the shop, his hands strong and steady at her waist. For a moment they stood close, neither stepping away immediately. "Thank you for showing me your property," Johanna said. "It's going to be a fine horse farm." "Thank you for your company," Flynn replied. He hesitated, then bent slightly to kiss her cheek, a gesture both proper and intimate. "Until tomorrow." Johanna watched him ride away, her hand rising unconsciously to touch the spot where his lips had brushed her skin. For the first time in years, she felt something beyond the determination to survive, a flicker of hope for something more. The next week passed in a blur of activity. Johanna submitted her bid for the railroad contract, a comprehensive proposal strengthened by Flynn's insights into railroad operations. Each day brought new customers to her shop, many curious after her public demonstration, others genuinely interested in work they had previously taken elsewhere. Flynn called on her daily, sometimes bringing small gifts, wildflowers, a book of poetry he'd found at the general store, freshly baked cookies from the hotel restaurant. In the evenings, they would often walk together through town, ignoring the stares and whispers their companionship generated. The town's reaction to their growing relationship was predictably mixed. Some women watched with envy. Flynn was handsome, well-spoken, and clearly prosperous. Others muttered about Johanna's unfeminine profession, making her an unsuitable match for any decent man. The men of St. Joe seemed particularly bothered, as though Flynn's interest in Johanna somehow challenged their own standing. 10 days after the demonstration, the town council announced their decision on the railroad contract. Sheriff Parker delivered the news personally to Johanna's shop, where she was showing Flynn a new design for horse bits she was developing. "Miss Keller," Parker began awkwardly, "the council has reviewed all bids for the railroad contract." Johanna steeled herself for the rejection she still half expected, despite the success of the demonstration. "The contract has been awarded to you," Parker continued, sounding somewhat disbelieving of his own words. "Your bid was the most comprehensive, your rates competitive, and your demonstrated skill was deemed adequate for the requirements." Johanna stood motionless, shock rendering her momentarily speechless. Flynn's hand found hers, squeezing gently in congratulation. "Thank you, Sheriff," she finally managed. "I'm honored by the council's confidence." Parker handed her an official document. "Work begins in 3 weeks. Mr. Wells will be by tomorrow to discuss specifics." He cleared his throat. "For what it's worth, Miss Keller, your father would be proud." After he left, Johanna turned to Flynn, her expression a mixture of disbelief and joy. "They actually awarded me the contract," Flynn smiled. "They'd have been fools not to after your demonstration. Even the most prejudiced man can't argue with superior craftsmanship." "I couldn't have done this without you," she said softly. "You could have," he corrected her. "You had the skill all along. I just helped create an opportunity for it to be seen." Impulsively, Johanna leaned forward and kissed him a brief, soft touch of lips that surprised them both with its boldness. When she pulled back, Flynn's eyes had darkened with an emotion that made her breath catch. "I've been wanting to do that for days," she admitted. "I've been wanting you to," he replied, his voice low. He cupped her face gently, drawing her back to him for another kiss, longer this time, deeper, a promise of feelings that were growing stronger by the day. The railroad contract transformed Johanna's business and her standing in St. Joe. Within a month, she had hired 2 assistants, young men eager to learn the trade who showed none of the resistance to her leadership that older smiths might have. The shop expanded its hours, and the steady flow of railroad work brought stability she hadn't known since her father's time. Flynn's horse farm took shape as well. The repairs Johanna had helped plan were completed, and the first breeding stock arrived, 6 mares and 2 stallions, with plans for more. He rode into town several times a week, dividing his time between developing his property and courting Johanna with a dedication that soon had the town buzzing with speculation. Their courtship progressed with the same straightforward honesty that had marked their first encounters. Flynn spoke of his experiences in the war, the nightmares that sometimes still woke him, the years of drifting afterward when he couldn't bear to stay in one place. Johanna shared her own struggles, the loneliness after her father's death, the daily battle for respect, the moments when she had nearly given up. 3 months after Flynn arrived in St. Joe, He invited Johanna to dinner at his now renovated farmhouse. His housekeeper, Mrs. Bennett, had prepared a special meal before discreetly retiring to her quarters in the back of the house. They sat in the small but comfortable parlor afterward, the room warmed by a fire against the autumn chill. Flynn seemed unusually contemplative, his usual easy manner replaced by something more serious. "What's troubling you?" Johanna finally asked. Flynn smiled faintly. "Nothing's troubling me, just the opposite." He took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I've been thinking about the future." "And what do you see in this future?" she asked, her heart quickening. "You," he said simply. "If you'll have me." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box, opening it to reveal a delicate gold band set with a small but perfect diamond. "Johanna Keller, I love you. Your strength, your skill, your determination. The way you face each day on your own terms, regardless of what others think. I want to build a life with you, not to change you or take you from your work, but to walk beside you through whatever comes." Tears blurred Johanna's vision as he continued. "Will you marry me? Be my wife, my partner, the mother of my children someday, while still being the finest blacksmith in Missouri?" She laughed through her tears at his last words. "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Yes to all of it." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms, sealing their engagement with a kiss that held all the promise of the future they would build together. They were married a month later in a small ceremony at the town church. To Johanna's surprise, most of St. Joe attended. Her success with the railroad contract had gradually shifted public opinion, and Flynn's obvious devotion had softened even some of the hardest hearts. Thomas Wells and Edward Mason remained coldly polite, but others who had once scorned her now offered genuine congratulations. Most touching was old Samuel Peterson, who presented her with a set of finely crafted specialized tools from his own collection. "Your father was a friend," the old blacksmith told her gruffly. "He'd be proud to see you today, both for your success at the forge and for finding a man worthy of you." Flynn had insisted Johanna keep her shop after their marriage. "Your skill is too valuable to lose," he'd said. "We'll find a way to balance both our businesses." And they did. Johanna continued running the blacksmith shop in town, expanding her railroad work to include contracts from neighboring counties. Flynn's horse breeding operation flourished, his animals gaining a reputation for quality that brought buyers from as far as St. Louis and Chicago. They split their time between the farm and a small apartment above the blacksmith shop, which they renovated for comfort. Johanna trained her assistants thoroughly, allowing her more time at the farm as they became proficient. A year after their wedding, their first child was born, a son they named James, after Johanna's father. Even with motherhood added to her responsibilities, Johanna maintained her work, bringing the baby to the shop with her when he was small, then arranging care as he grew. When James was 2, a daughter joined the family, Elizabeth, with her father's eyes and her mother's determination. By then, Johanna had established herself as one of the most respected blacksmiths in western Missouri, with railroad contracts that kept her shop busy year-round. The people of St. Joe gradually accepted what had once seemed impossible: a woman mastering a man's trade, building a successful business, and creating a loving family. Those who had once ridiculed her now pointed to our blacksmith with pride when visitors came to town. 5 years after Flynn first rode into St. Joe with a thrown horseshoe, he and Johanna stood together on the porch of their farmhouse, watching their children play in the yard with the foals from that season's breeding. The farm had grown to 300 acres, with a reputation for producing some of the finest horses in the state. Johanna's blacksmith shop had expanded to include a second location in Jefferson City, run by her most skilled former assistant. Did you ever imagine this? Flynn asked, his arm around her waist, her head resting against his shoulder. That day when I rode into your shop and those men were giving you grief, Johanna smiled, watching James attempt to teach his little sister how to pet a foal properly. Never. I was just trying to survive each day. And now, she turned in his arms to face him, her hands still strong and calloused from her work coming up to frame his face. Now I'm not just surviving, I'm living, fully, completely living. Flynn kissed her, the same tenderness in his touch that had been there from the beginning, now deepened by years of shared life and love. The best decision I ever made, he murmured against her lips, was throwing that horseshoe 3 miles outside of St. Joe. Johanna laughed, her eyes bright with happiness. The best decision I ever made was fixing it for you. As twilight settled over the Missouri countryside, the family gathered inside their home, a blacksmith, a horse breeder, and their children, creating a life that defied convention but embodied the true spirit of the West: determination, skill, and the courage to forge one's own path, whatever others might say. In the years that followed, Johanna and Zachariah Flynn became fixtures in the community, their unlikely love story eventually becoming part of local legend. People forgot there was ever a time when a woman blacksmith seemed impossible, just as they forgot their initial skepticism about the quiet stranger who had recognized her worth when no one else would. Their partnership, in business and in life, stood as testimony to what could be built when skill was valued above prejudice, and when love was founded on respect rather than convention. And it all began with a thrown horseshoe, a skillful hammer, and the courage to see beyond the expectations of others to the true potential that lay within.